Imagine standing on a field in Normandy, summer 1944. The air is thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the distant roar of diesel engines echoes across the countryside. The German panzers, iron monsters clad in steel, are grinding forward with mechanical certainty. The earth trembles beneath their tracks, and for a soldier crouching in the hedgerows, it feels as if nothing could stop the black tide of armor rolling in. Yet the sky carries its own answer. A piercing shriek splits the air, like a scythe swung by an invisible hand. Out of the low clouds dives the A-36 Apache, a little-known variant of the Mustang lineage, hurtling earthward with terrifying velocity. The whistle of its dive sirens howls across the battlefield, a sound so unnerving that even veteran soldiers described it as more frightening than artillery fire. A moment later, the payload falls, the explosion rips through the armored column, and a panzer once deemed invincible becomes nothing more than a smoldering wreck. In that instant, German troops understood that death could come not from the hedgerows, but from the heavens. Picture the helplessness, a 30-ton steel beast, designed to dominate open ground, reduced to a coffin under the shadow of a single aircraft. Archival accounts tell us that Wehrmacht soldiers grew to dread the sound of the Apache's whistle. To them, it was not a machine, it was a predator, one that struck with such precision that their armor felt irrelevant. And the irony? The A-36 was never intended to be a star of the air war. It was a stopgap, a testbed version of the Mustang series, pressed into service while more refined models were still on the drawing board. Yet it was this stopgap solution that carved terror into the minds of panzer crews. I believe this is where the story becomes more than just a tale of machines. It is about hubris versus improvisation, about a Reich that trusted its armored fists to hold the line, and an Allied command willing to gamble on an unproven tool. In this documentary, we will move through battlefields, diaries, technical papers, and eyewitness voices to uncover the truth. War is rarely won by the strongest weapon alone. Sometimes, it is the underestimated, the temporary, the good enough that rewrites the course of history. If you are watching this, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss future cinematic deep dives into the hidden stories of warfare. Every machine, every clash, holds a lesson buried beneath the smoke and rubble. Today's lesson begins with a single shriek in the sky, the Apache's call, and the moment Panzer Divisions realized that even steel has its predator. The summer of 1944 was a season of contradictions. On one hand, Germany still wielded formidable armored divisions, the pride of the Wehrmacht. Panzers had spearheaded campaigns across Europe since 1939, tearing through Poland, France, and deep into the Soviet Union. They had become more than machines. They were symbols of Blitzkrieg, embodiments of industrial might fused with tactical doctrine. To Allied infantry staring down their barrels, a panzer was not just an enemy vehicle, it was inevitability made of steel. Yet by mid-war, the illusion of invincibility was cracking. The Allies, pressed by necessity, were experimenting with ways to counter this armored juggernaut. Heavy artillery and tank destroyers were one solution. But the air, that fluid, unpredictable battlefield above the fields and villages of Europe, offered a more versatile answer. Air power was not bound by terrain, not stalled by rivers or destroyed bridges. It could appear, vanish, and reappear with terrifying unpredictability. This is where the A-36 Apache enters the story. Often overshadowed by its famous descendant, the P-51 Mustang, the Apache was initially considered a compromise. Designed as a dive bomber rather than a pure fighter, its mission profile seemed modest: attack ground targets, harass enemy supply lines, and provide close air support. Few expected it to directly challenge the armored spearheads of the German army. Yet in practice, its sudden arrival on the battlefield exposed a deep vulnerability. Tanks might dominate the ground, but they were dangerously exposed from above. Accounts from German soldiers at the front highlight this shift. Letters describe how crews would strain their ears for the distinctive whistle of dive sirens. Once they heard it, they knew survival depended on seconds, finding cover, abandoning their machine, or praying for cloud cover. The tanks themselves, though armored, were not invulnerable. Thin top armor made them highly susceptible to bombs, rockets, and strafing runs. For men who had once felt invincible, the Apache's attack stripped away the illusion in a matter of moments. From the Allied perspective, the Apache became more than just a stopgap. Reports from U.S. commanders praised its ability to disrupt German columns and halt reinforcements before they reached the front. Infantry units spoke of newfound confidence, knowing that the shriek from above often meant salvation rather than doom. In many ways, the Apache leveled the psychological playing field. Where once German armor inspired dread, now the Allies had their own instrument of fear. But the story is not simply one of victory. The Apache's success illuminated broader questions about the nature of warfare. How do armies adapt when their most prized assets are suddenly vulnerable? How do weapons designed for one role, in this case, a dive bomber, find unexpected effectiveness in another? And what does it say about strategy when improvisation outperforms meticulous planning? The central problem, then, was clear. The German war machine had invested enormous resources into tanks as the backbone of its offensive and defensive operations. Yet tanks were never designed to fight the sky. The Allies, by contrast, were willing to exploit this asymmetry. The A-36 was not perfect. It lacked the glamour of the Mustang, the raw power of heavy bombers, or the agility of dedicated fighters. But it didn't need perfection. It needed only to strike fear, to disrupt, to remind panzer crews that their dominance had limits. And that is what makes this story enduring. The clash between panzers and Apaches was not just about steel and firepower. It was about psychology, adaptation, and the irony of war, that sometimes the weapon nobody expected to matter becomes the one that changes everything. As we move deeper into this narrative, we will see how technical specifications met battlefield realities, how doctrine collided with improvisation, and how soldiers on both sides recorded their fears and hopes in diaries that still echo today. Because beyond the numbers and statistics lies the lived truth. For every Apache that dove from the clouds, there were men on the ground looking up, realizing that the battlefield had shifted forever. The summer of 1944 was a theater of paradox. On the one hand, the German Wehrmacht still possessed armored divisions that symbolized both pride and power. The panzer formations had been the tip of the spear during the lightning campaigns of 1939 through 1941, crashing through Poland, sweeping across France, and driving deep into Soviet territory. They embodied the very doctrine of Blitzkrieg: shock, speed, and mechanized dominance. For the infantrymen who faced them, the sight of a panzer on the horizon was enough to unravel nerves. It felt like a wall of inevitability, steel fused with doctrine, bearing down on flesh and bone. Yet by 1944, this narrative of invincibility was fraying. Allied forces had learned, adapted, and improvised. Artillery could delay armored thrusts, tank destroyers could contest ground, but the true equalizer was overhead. Air power offered what terrain could not: flexibility. It was not confined by rivers, forests, or rubble. It could appear suddenly, vanish, and strike again. And in that role, the unlikely A-36 Apache stepped into history. The Apache was never meant to be glamorous. It was a derivative of the Mustang design, modified with dive brakes for precision ground attack. In technical terms, its Allison V1710 engine lacked the high-altitude performance of later Merlin-powered Mustangs. But what it lost in ceiling, it gained in low-level lethality. Armed with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns and capable of carrying up to 1,000 pounds of bombs, it was not a dogfighter, it was a Predator tailored for close air support. To understand why panzer crews dreaded the Apache, we must look at the anatomy of their own machines. German tanks like the Panzer IV and even the fearsome Tiger I carried thick frontal and side armor, designed to withstand artillery shells and tank rounds. But their roofs were thin, often under 25 millimeters. Against bombs dropped from a dive bomber, that armor was paper. One well-placed hit could disable the turret, rupture the engine compartment, or ignite ammunition stowed within. In practice, a panzer column caught in the open by a flight of Apaches could lose both machines and morale within minutes. Field reports from Normandy describe this vividly. Infantrymen recount seeing entire convoys scatter in panic as the distinctive whistle of dive brakes cut through the air. German letters captured after battles reveal a similar fear. Soldiers spoke of abandoning vehicles not yet destroyed, convinced that staying inside meant certain death. The machine designed to terrify became the coffin of its crew. From a purely technical lens, the Apache's efficiency lay not only in firepower but in the psychology of its attack profile. Diving at nearly 70 degrees, its sirens screamed like banshees. Even before the bombs fell, the sound alone disrupted cohesion. Allied commanders noted that the Apache's ability to suppress German movement was often more decisive than the physical destruction it caused. An armored column stalled by fear was as valuable as one annihilated outright. To appreciate this in numbers, consider a German Panzer IV advancing with 80 mm frontal armor. Against tank shells, it could withstand considerable punishment. Yet the roof armor measured only 16 to 20 mm. A 500-pound bomb, carried by the Apache, generated explosive force far beyond that threshold. Engineers later calculated that even a near miss could compromise the suspension or disable tracks. Thus, the cost-effectiveness equation was brutal. A single aircraft sortie could halt dozens of tons of enemy steel. The irony deepens when one examines how the A-36 came to be. Initially dismissed as a stopgap, its dive bombing role was supposed to be temporary, filling a gap until better aircraft arrived. Yet history has a way of elevating the unexpected. In practice, the Apache demonstrated that good enough could prove decisive, precisely because the enemy never expected it. Where German armor embodied perfectionist engineering, the Apache represented improvisation, a weapon born not of ideal conditions, but of necessity. As we continue, the story of Panzers versus Apaches will unfold not only in terms of battlefield encounters, but in the stark contrast of doctrines. The Germans bet on invulnerable machines. The Allies bet on exploiting vulnerabilities. And somewhere in that clash, the shriek of the Apache became louder than the roar of the Panzer. The battlefield evidence further illustrates how the Apache shifted dynamics at the tactical level. German reports mention that units delayed movements until nightfall or under heavy cloud cover, fearing exposure to Allied aircraft. What had once been an advantage, the speed of mechanized advance, was now shackled by the fear of sudden attack from the skies. It was not only a matter of destroyed tanks but also of disrupted timetables, missed opportunities, and fraying nerves. The Apache's dive bombing profile was particularly effective against concentrated armor. Unlike level bombers, which required massed formations and precise coordination, a single A-36 could swoop down and target individual vehicles or chokepoints such as bridges and crossroads. This precision mattered immensely in Europe's narrow lanes and bocage country. A destroyed bridge halted a battalion. A disabled lead tank created a bottleneck. Thus, even when destruction was partial, the ripple effects magnified across entire divisions. Numbers again tell the tale. During operations in Italy, records show that A-36 units achieved thousands of sorties in just months, with reported destruction of dozens of vehicles and suppression of countless enemy positions. German commanders complained that even when losses were light, their mobility was crippled. The psychological factor translated directly into operational paralysis. In military terms, this was force multiplication, a modest weapon producing outsized strategic effects. Comparisons highlight the uniqueness of the Apache's role. The British Typhoon, for instance, carried rockets that could devastate armor, but its accuracy in the early years was inconsistent. Heavy bombers could annihilate cities but lacked precision against mobile targets. The Apache sat in a narrow but critical niche, low-altitude, precision dive attacks against field targets. Its very limitations, poor high-altitude performance, reduced range compared to later Mustangs, became strengths when missions demanded close proximity to ground forces. Let us consider a technical vignette. A Tiger I tank, weighing over 50 tons, armored with 100 mm at the front, seemed nearly impervious to Allied tank guns. Yet its roof armor remained only 25 mm thick. The Apache, armed with two 500-pound bombs, could release them in a dive from 10,000 feet, adjusting trajectory with dive brakes that stabilized aim. Engineers noted that the blast radius of such bombs far exceeded the threshold required to buckle top armor. Even a glancing explosion could damage optics, tracks, or the vulnerable engine deck. In effect, the Apache turned the tank's greatest strength, frontal armor, into irrelevance. Allied infantry corroborated this with their diaries. Soldiers spoke of newfound morale, describing the Apache's siren as a guardian's call. When pinned by machine gun fire or stalked by armor, the sound of an approaching dive bomber meant the battle might turn. On the German side, captured letters show the inverse. Soldiers confessed that they dreaded daylight marches, begging for orders to move under darkness. Some even wrote of leaving tanks camouflaged and walking alongside them, hoping to reduce the risk of being trapped inside a burning shell. What emerges, then, is a portrait of imbalance. The German war machine had invested decades of industrial genius into armored superiority, yet had underestimated the vulnerability of that superiority when exposed to vertical attack. The Allies, meanwhile, stumbled upon a solution not through grand design but through improvisation. They deployed the A-36 because it was available, because it filled a gap, and in doing so, discovered that the gap itself could become a weapon. This irony is the essence of the problem. War rarely rewards perfection. It rewards adaptability. The Panzer Divisions represented an apex of armored doctrine, but doctrines calcify. The Apache, imperfect and temporary, thrived precisely because it was flexible, because it exploited the unforeseen. Its technical profile, Allison engine, dive brakes, bomb load, was not glamorous, but in the mud and smoke of Normandy and Italy, it was enough to unravel the aura of German armor. By 1944, the balance of power was no longer measured solely in tons of steel or millimeters of armor. It was measured in fear, in hesitation, in the seconds between hearing a whistle and bracing for impact. And in those seconds, the A-36 Apache became not just an aircraft, but a symbol of how war punishes arrogance and rewards ingenuity. The story of the A-36 Apache is written most vividly not in tables of specifications, but in the dust, fire, and human voices left behind on the battlefields where it clashed with the German Panzer Divisions. To understand its impact, we need to follow the war's timeline, watching how this modest aircraft grew from an experimental tool into a symbol of Allied adaptation that shook the very confidence of German armored forces. In 1943, the stage was set in Tunisia, where American troops were still learning the brutal lessons of modern mechanized warfare. The German Afrika Korps, led by veterans hardened on the Eastern Front and in earlier campaigns, wielded its panzers with terrifying efficiency. At Kasserine Pass, Allied lines buckled under pressure, and for a moment it seemed that history might repeat itself, another crushing defeat at the hands of Blitzkrieg. But in the weeks that followed, the A-36 Apache was committed to the front. Pilots found that desert terrain, with its exposed ridges and narrow wadis, offered opportunities for dive attacks that no German tank crew could easily counter. The thin roof armor of Panzer IIIs and IVs, rarely more than 20 millimeters thick, was no match for a 500-pound bomb dropped from a near-vertical dive. Reports spoke of convoys halted, counterattacks broken, and infantry gaining precious hours to regroup. An American officer wrote afterward that the shriek of the Apache's dive brakes drew a curtain across the enemy's momentum, and though the heat and dust often strained engines, the psychological curtain was real. It mocked the moment when even the vaunted German armor had to look skyward with dread. The transition to Sicily in July 1943 proved that Tunisia had not been a fluke. Operation Husky demanded that Allied troops establish fragile beachheads while German and Italian forces maneuvered to throw them back into the sea. The Panzer Divisions, confident in their ability to counterattack on narrow island roads, prepared to strike. Yet the Apaches were waiting. Pilots learned to use the geography itself, steep valleys, mountain passes, and chokepoints, to multiply the effect of their dives. In one account, an Apache bomb destroyed the lead vehicle of a panzer column bound for Jela, trapping dozens of tanks on a single road. Subsequent strafing ignited fuel trucks, turning the pass into a furnace that immobilized the entire formation. German diaries recovered later speak of tanks becoming iron coffins under the sun, while Allied infantry wrote of cheering whenever the sirens wailed above their heads. The numbers only reinforce this narrative. Apache units flew more than 1,200 sorties during the Sicily campaign, disrupting reinforcements and destroying dozens of vehicles. But beyond the numbers was a larger truth. German armored power could no longer move freely in daylight. Italy from late 1943 into 1944 became the true test of endurance. Unlike the deserts of Tunisia or the confined roads of Sicily, the Italian peninsula presented rugged mountains, rivers, and valleys that made movement difficult for both sides. Yet those very features created perfect targets for the Apache's precision. Every bridge, every crossroads, every winding mountain road became a potential trap. Pilots dove nearly vertically, dive brakes howling, to drop bombs on spans across the Volturno or convoys inching through the Apennines. German commanders, desperate to preserve mobility, ordered tanks camouflaged with branches, dispersed into small groups, or moved only at night. Each adaptation slowed operations and conceded initiative. Allied engineers later calculated that the destruction of a single bridge might delay a division by days, and Apache pilots made such destruction routine. The scale of the Italian campaign highlights the consistency of this impact. Records count over 23,000 sorties flown by A-36 groups in Italy alone. Losses were not insignificant. Flak batteries and Luftwaffe fighters claimed their share, but the cumulative disruption was undeniable. A captured German officer confessed under interrogation, "We did not fear the tanks of the Allies as much as we feared their aircraft. One machine could undo the work of an entire regiment." That confession, born of exhaustion and frustration, underscores the imbalance that had crept into the German war machine. They had invested years of industrial genius into creating armored superiority, but they had underestimated how fragile that superiority became when exposed to a weapon born not of perfection but of improvisation. By the time the Allies prepared for the invasion of Normandy, the Apache had already proven itself as more than a stopgap. It had become a weapon that reshaped the rhythm of battle, forcing the panzers, once avatars of unstoppable power, into caution, hesitation, and fear. The next stage of the war, unfolding on the fields and hedgerows of France, would push this dynamic further still, showing how the shriek from above could echo louder than the roar of tracks on the ground. By June 1944, the war had shifted decisively to Western Europe. The Allies, having learned from Tunisia, Sicily, and Italy, now faced the monumental task of landing in Normandy and breaking through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. The German High Command placed enormous faith in its Panzer Divisions to repel the invasion. They were held in reserve as the hammer blow that would crush the Allies on the beaches. Yet as the landings unfolded, the A-36 Apache once again reminded the world that tanks, however mighty, could not dominate the skies. The Apache's role on D-Day itself was not glamorous. Heavy bombers and naval artillery commanded most of the spotlight. But in the days that followed, as Allied troops struggled through the bocage, the tangled hedgerows and narrow lanes of Normandy, the Apache found its natural hunting ground. German armor, designed for open plains, struggled to maneuver in this claustrophobic terrain. Columns were forced to move along predictable routes, and it was here that the Apache's precision dive bombing became lethal. Pilots described attacking convoys on sunken roads where a single destroyed lead tank could trap an entire formation. Even when bombs missed, the strafing runs tore apart supply trucks, fuel carriers, and artillery pieces, leaving the tanks isolated and starving for support. One particularly vivid account comes from the days after the landings, when the 12th SS Panzer Division attempted to counterattack Allied positions near Cannes. Reports note that A-36 sorties targeted bridges and crossroads, delaying the movement of reserves and forcing the division to scatter into smaller groups. Infantrymen who had braced for a massive armored push found themselves facing piecemeal attacks, robbed of coordination by strikes from the sky. A British officer remarked in his journal that the Apaches turned the thunder of armor into the nervous shuffle of isolated machines. The technical factors remained consistent with earlier campaigns. The Panzer IV, with its 80mm frontal armor, was still formidable against Allied tank guns. But its roof remained vulnerable, often no thicker than 20mm. The Apache's 500-pound bombs, released from a near-vertical dive, generated blast effects that exceeded this threshold many times over. Even near misses could bend tracks, rupture engines, or dislodge turrets. Engineers later calculated that in Normandy's hedgerow country, where tanks had little room to maneuver, a single Apache flight could neutralize a column of armor more efficiently than artillery barges. Yet Normandy also introduced a new challenge: the density of German anti-aircraft defenses. The hedgerows that confined tanks also sheltered flak guns. Apache losses mounted, with crews forced to fly low through mazes of fire. But even this attrition did not blunt their effect. For every aircraft shot down, dozens of German vehicles were delayed, destroyed, or forced into cover. The very act of hiding from the Apache slowed German timetables, disrupting the precise coordination that Blitzkrieg doctrine required. As the summer wore on, the battle for Cannes became a prolonged struggle where air power often dictated the tempo. The Germans committed Tiger tanks to hold the city, their thick frontal armor nearly invulnerable to most Allied weapons. But again the Apache found the chink in the armor. Roof hits, engine deck strikes, and near misses on bridges reduced even the mighty Tiger to a liability. Pilots recalled the satisfaction of watching entire crews abandon their machines at the first scream of dive brakes. In the words of one U.S. sergeant, the Tigers did not roar that summer, they crouched and prayed. By August 1944, the German line in Normandy was collapsing. The Falaise pocket trapped tens of thousands of German troops, many of whom fell victim to relentless air attacks. While typhoons and thunderbolts often receive credit for this destruction, the Apache played its share, particularly in precision strikes that sealed escape routes. Roads choked with burning armor testified to the futility of trying to flee under clear skies. A German survivor later recalled that they moved only at night, abandoning tanks by the roadside when fuel ran out, because the day belonged to the aircraft. That admission summed up the transformation wrought by planes like the Apache. The Panzer, once the terror of Europe, now lived in fear of daylight. The Normandy campaign underscored not only the Apache's tactical role, but also its strategic significance. It was no longer enough for German tanks to be powerful, they had to be mobile, and mobility was precisely what air power denied them. The A-36, though overshadowed by its Mustang descendants, had become part of a larger Allied doctrine. Deny the enemy movement, deny them freedom, and watch their strength dissolve in place. In the bocage, in the fields around Cannes, and in the killing grounds of the Falaise pocket, the Apache scream became part of the soundtrack of victory. The collapse of German positions in Normandy pushed the war into a new phase. By late summer 1944, Allied armies surged across France, exploiting the breaches created by air-ground coordination. German commanders, though still relying on their armored divisions to stem the tide, faced a grim reality. Every daylight movement risked annihilation from the skies. For the A-36 Apache, this was the moment when its role matured from tactical nuisance to strategic constraint. The panzers were no longer simply destroyed, they were immobilized, dictated by the rhythm of aircraft overhead. As Allied columns advanced toward Paris, Apache units concentrated on disrupting German withdrawal routes. Bridges, rail junctions, and chokepoints became primary targets. One report from late August described an Apache flight that intercepted a retreating panzer column near the Seine. The pilots dove almost vertically, their sirens shrieking, and within minutes the lead and rear vehicles were burning, sealing the column in place. Allied ground forces later found dozens of abandoned machines, their crews having fled under the psychological weight of constant air attack. Even when bombs did not strike directly, the disruption was enough to fragment what should have been organized retreats into chaotic routes. By autumn, the Germans regrouped along the borders of Belgium and the Netherlands, preparing for a desperate counteroffensive. This culminated in December 1944 with the Battle of the Bulge, the last great gamble of Hitler's Panzer Divisions in the West. In the opening days, heavy snow and cloud cover grounded much of the Allied Air Force, and for a brief moment the panzers moved with their old freedom. Columns of Tigers and Panthers surged through the Ardennes, and Allied infantry once again felt the weight of mechanized thunder pressing forward. But weather, as always, is fickle. When the skies cleared, the Apache returned to the hunt. Pilots recalled the Ardennes as one of the most harrowing environments they faced. The dense forests made spotting difficult, the cold taxed both men and machines, and German flak was concentrated around key routes. Yet it was precisely in these conditions that the Apache's low-level dive attacks proved invaluable. Tanks forced to move along icy roads or through narrow valleys were easy prey once located. An after-action report noted that during the second week of the offensive, Apache sorties struck convoys moving toward Bastogne, destroying fuel trucks and halting entire battalions. American paratroopers besieged in the town later credited airstrikes, including those by Apaches, with keeping German armor from overrunning their lines. The technical imbalance remained stark. German Panthers boasted formidable frontal armor of up to 100 mm, but the top remained their Achilles heel, rarely exceeding 25 mm. A 500-pound bomb from an Apache, even without a direct hit, generated shockwaves capable of shattering suspension systems or detonating fuel stores. Engineers studying wrecks after the battle found turrets blown off their rings, tracks snapped, and hulls buckled from concussive force. The Tiger II, or King Tiger, the heaviest tank fielded by the Wehrmacht, was theoretically immune to Allied guns from the front. Yet even this behemoth succumbed when struck from above. One pilot wrote in his logbook that the so-called king burned like any other beast once caught in the open. The psychological toll deepened. German accounts from the Ardennes repeatedly mentioned the dread of daylight once the weather cleared. A Panzer grenadier described how entire crews would abandon tanks at the first sound of dive brakes, preferring to survive on foot rather than risk being entombed in steel. For Allied infantry, the opposite was true. Morale surged whenever the skies opened. Soldiers spoke of watching Apaches swoop down like hawks, scattering enemy formations that had seemed unstoppable only hours earlier. The Battle of the Bulge underscored the truth that had been building since Tunisia. Air power had transformed the balance of armored warfare. Tanks could dominate only if they moved, and the Apache, along with other Allied aircraft, stripped them of that freedom. The German offensive ground to a halt not only because of fuel shortages and fierce resistance, but because the very concept of Blitzkrieg, speed, surprise, concentrated force, could not survive in a sky owned by Allied aircraft. The A-36, often overshadowed by its more famous descendants, contributed directly to this strategic failure by attacking the vulnerable arteries of German movement. By early 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany itself, the role of the Apache was both routine and decisive. It was no longer a surprise weapon, it was an expected part of the battlefield, a constant predator whose presence defined the limits of German mobility. Tanks that had once spearheaded conquests across Europe were reduced to defensive traps, dug into villages or forests, hiding from the daylight they had once roared across so confidently. For the men on the ground, both Allied and German, the sound of the Apache's siren had become part of the landscape of war, a reminder that steel alone could not guarantee survival when the sky itself was hostile. By March 1945, the Allied armies stood on the banks of the Rhine. The river represented both a physical and psychological barrier, the last great obstacle before the heart of Germany itself. The Wehrmacht, battered and bleeding, attempted to rally its remaining Panzer Divisions for a final defense. Yet by this stage, the presence of aircraft like the A-36 Apache ensured that every attempt at concentration was doomed before it began. When Allied forces seized the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, German commanders rushed armor and artillery to destroy the precarious foothold. But the Apaches, flying sorties in coordination with artillery spotters, hammered the approaches. Tanks advancing to the bridgehead were caught in open fields and reduced to burning wrecks. Engineers noted later that aerial interdiction, more than ground fire, prevented the Germans from mounting an organized counterattack. The very survival of the bridge, despite repeated attempts by the Wehrmacht to demolish it, highlighted how air power had become the ultimate guarantor of Allied momentum. As the Allies crossed the Rhine in strength, the Apache's mission shifted to pursuit and annihilation. Columns of retreating German forces clogged roads leading east, and pilots described scenes of near-total destruction. Convoys of trucks, half-tracks, and tanks stretched for miles, only to be broken apart by precision dives. One airman recalled the eerie sight of entire highways littered with burning vehicles, as if the road itself had turned to flame. German diaries from this period speak of despair. Fuel was scarce, supplies were dwindling, and the constant threat from above made even short movements an ordeal. The deeper the Allies pushed into Germany, the more the imbalance became obvious. The once feared panzers were now reduced to static defenses, dug into towns or hidden in forests. The Apache excelled in rooting them out. Dive bombing against buildings, crossroads, or tree lines denied the Germans even the illusion of cover. Reports from April 1945 detail how A-36 groups coordinated with advancing infantry, circling overhead until resistance points were spotted, then diving to crack them open. In effect, the Apache had become not just a tank buster but an extension of ground assault, collapsing strongpoints before they could delay the Allied tide. Even the most advanced German armor, such as the King Tiger and Jagged Panther, offered no salvation. Captured crews later admitted that their machines, while impressive on paper, were liabilities in practice. Too heavy for many bridges, too fuel-hungry for dwindling supplies, and too slow to escape airstrikes. An Apache dive could not only destroy a vehicle but render entire companies immobile by collapsing the infrastructure they depended on. In this sense, the Apache's impact was systemic, striking not only machines but the networks of movement and supply that sustained them. By May 1945, the Reich was collapsing on all fronts. In Berlin, Soviet artillery thundered as the Red Army closed in, while in the West, Allied troops advanced with the sky firmly in their hands. The Apache, though never produced in the numbers of other aircraft, had written itself into the fabric of these final months. Its legacy lay not only in the wreckage of German armor but in the psychological defeat it inflicted. Veterans later remembered how German soldiers grew resigned, almost fatalistic, whenever the wail of dive brakes split the air. Allied infantry, by contrast, described those same sounds as the music of salvation, knowing that steel predators in the sky watched over their advance. The closing months of the war revealed the full arc of the Apache's journey. Born as a stopgap, doubted even by some within the Allied command, it had matured through Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and the Ardennes into a proven tool of precision interdiction. By 1945, it was no longer experimental. It was essential. Its shriek marked the rhythm of battle, from deserts to bocage to forests and finally to the ruined heart of Germany. And while it would soon be overshadowed by jet fighters and the Mustang's long-range fame, the Apache's role in defeating the Panzers was secure. Looking back, the image that remains is cinematic: a lone German tank halted at a crossroads, its crew scanning nervously for threats ahead, only to hear the growing howl from above. The bomb falls, the earth erupts, and the myth of armored invincibility shatters once more. This scene, repeated across 2 continents, captured the essence of how the Apache helped turn the tide of history. For the Panzer Divisions that once terrified Europe, the sky had become a trap, and the A-36 Apache was its hunter. The story of the A-36 Apache is not merely one of daring dives and shattered armor, it is also a lesson in contrasts. By examining how the Allies used this aircraft versus how the Germans deployed their own armored and air assets, we uncover the deeper strategic mistakes that doomed the Panzer Divisions. The most obvious comparison lies between the Apache and the Panzer itself. The Panzer represented the culmination of German mechanized doctrine, speed, coordination, and shock action. The Apache, by contrast, was never designed to be a dedicated tank killer. It was a dive bomber born from necessity, adapted from the P-51 Mustang's airframe with reinforced wings, dive brakes, and the capacity to carry bombs. On paper, one might assume that the specialized purpose-built tank would always dominate a converted fighter bomber. Yet history proved the opposite. The mismatch begins with vulnerability. German tank designers, obsessed with frontal armor and firepower, overlooked the simple fact that tanks are weakest from above. Roof armor rarely exceeded 25 mm, even on the heaviest models. By 1943, the Allies understood this and invested heavily in platforms capable of exploiting the weakness. The Apache's dive profile, plunging at angles approaching 70 degrees, ensured accuracy and concentrated explosive force where tanks could least defend. German planners never created an equivalent air doctrine. Their Stukas had been effective earlier in the war but had become obsolete by 1941, too slow and too vulnerable to modern fighters. By the time the Apache entered service, Germany had no real counterpart. Another critical contrast lies in logistics. A Panzer Division was a ravenous beast, requiring thousands of gallons of fuel and an intricate supply chain to remain mobile. The Apache's mission often targeted not the tanks themselves but the lifelines that fed them: bridges, depots, fuel convoys. This indirect approach was devastating. Even when German armor survived intact, it frequently sat immobilized for lack of supplies. Allied reports consistently emphasize how destruction of infrastructure delayed reinforcements by days. German mistakes compounded the problem. Hitler insisted on holding ground, forcing divisions to fight static battles when mobility was their lifeblood. In such situations, the Apache became a scalpel, cutting the arteries of Blitzkrieg. The Germans also miscalculated their defensive doctrine. Believing that anti-aircraft guns and camouflage would suffice, they underestimated the persistence and precision of Allied pilots. Flak took its toll, but it did not alter the outcome. Every downed Apache represented 1 or 2 pilots lost. Every destroyed Panzer represented dozens of crew and support personnel immobilized, plus the irreplaceable weight of steel and fuel wasted. Attrition favored the Allies because aircraft could be replaced faster than tanks could be built and deployed. The industrial balance was stark. By 1944, Allied aircraft production outpaced German tank output by a margin of several to 1. The failure to adapt doctrine to this industrial reality was a fatal German error. Technical comparisons highlight the contrast further. A Panzer IV weighed around 25 tons, with a high-velocity 75 mm gun capable of piercing Allied armor. Yet its mobility was tied to fuel-hungry engines vulnerable to strafing. The A-36, by comparison, carried 2 500-pound bombs and 6.50 caliber machine guns, giving it versatility against both hard and soft targets. Its top speed exceeded 350 miles per hour, far beyond any tank's ability to counter. In a duel between steel on the ground and steel in the air, the result was not even close. The Apache did not need to destroy every tank. It needed only to disrupt columns, sever bridges, or ignite supply trucks. The Germans failed to recognize that the destruction of a single choke point often equaled the destruction of an entire battalion. The psychological dimension reveals perhaps the greatest mistake. German doctrine had always emphasized shock, the sudden appearance of panzers at critical points to collapse morale. But when Allied troops heard the scream of the Apache, the shock belonged to the defenders. Soldiers who had once broken under tank assaults now rallied with renewed vigor when aircraft appeared overhead. German crews, by contrast, abandoned machines prematurely, demoralized by the inevitability of aerial attack. This inversion of morale was as decisive as any technical factor. Looking at what the Germans could have done differently exposes their blind spots. They might have invested in more heavily armored roofs or in dispersal tactics that reduced the vulnerability of concentrated columns. They could have prioritized night operations more systematically, exploiting hours when Allied aircraft were grounded. Most of all, they might have acknowledged that Blitzkrieg, brilliant in 1940, was unsustainable against an enemy with overwhelming air superiority. Instead, Hitler clung to the myth of the Panzer as war winner, pouring resources into heavier and heavier tanks like the Tiger II, machines that were slower, costlier, and easier to trap. The Apache thrived against exactly such targets, whose bulk and sluggishness made them perfect victims for dive bombing runs. The Allies, for their part, learned to adapt. The A-36 was never flawless. It was vulnerable to flak, required careful handling in dives, and suffered mechanical strains in hot climates. But rather than abandon the concept, the Allies refined it. They rotated pilots, improved tactics, and integrated Apache strikes into broader combined arms plans. This flexibility contrasted sharply with German rigidity. Where the Apache evolved into part of a system of interdiction, the Panzer became an increasingly isolated instrument, robbed of its synergy with air power. In the end, the comparison reveals a broader truth. Wars are not won by perfect machines, but by the ability to adapt tools to exploit the enemy's weaknesses. The Germans bet everything on the myth of invincible armor. The Allies, with the Apache among their arsenal, revealed that even the strongest tank is only as strong as the ground it moves upon, and that ground belongs to the power that controls the skies. The end of the Second World War did not mark the end of the A-36 Apache story. While production ceased after only 500 aircraft, and while its fame was soon eclipsed by the Mustang, Thunderbolt, and Typhoon, its legacy rippled across decades of military thought. The Apache's impact lay not just in the wreckage it left behind on European battlefields, but in the shift of doctrine and strategy it represented, the recognition that armored dominance on the ground could never again be separated from mastery of the air. In the immediate post-war years, Allied reports emphasized how crucial air interdiction had been in halting German counterattacks. The Apache's role in Italy, Normandy, and the Ardennes was repeatedly cited as proof that destroying tanks directly was less important than destroying their ability to move, supply, or concentrate. This insight shaped NATO doctrine during the early Cold War. The Soviet Union's massive tank armies loomed as the new threat, and Western planners turned instinctively to the lessons of the Apache. The belief that air power could paralyze armor without needing one-to-one destruction became the cornerstone of deterrence in Europe. This legacy materialized in the development of specialized aircraft. The lineage from the A-36 dive bombing runs can be traced to the post-war jet era, the F-84 Thunderjet, the F-100 Super Sabre, and eventually the A-10 Thunderbolt II. Each of these machines inherited the Apache's basic mission: precision attack against ground forces, especially armored ones. Engineers who had studied the vulnerabilities of panzers applied the same lessons to Soviet designs like the T-54 and T-62. The A-36 had demonstrated that tanks could be defeated not by building bigger tanks but by attacking their structural weaknesses from above. Beyond technology, the Apache also left a cultural imprint on how soldiers perceived warfare. For Allied infantrymen, the shriek of dive breaks became associated with salvation. This memory endured into the Korean and Vietnam Wars, where close air support was demanded with even greater urgency. Commanders who had once fought in Italy or France remembered vividly how air strikes could break enemy momentum. In interviews decades later, veterans still described the Apache's presence in emotional terms, recalling the feeling of being shielded by an unseen guardian. Such sentiments influenced not only doctrine but the political willingness to fund and maintain close air support fleets. The Germans, too, internalized the lesson. Post-war analyses conducted by former Wehrmacht officers for the U.S. Army's Historical Division repeatedly stressed how Allied air superiority, more than any single weapon, broke the backbone of panzer warfare. General Westphal, who served under Rommel, wrote bluntly that armor without air cover is condemned to immobility. His conclusion echoed the very experience inflicted by the Apache. Tanks could no longer be seen as independent decision-makers on the battlefield. They required integration with air defense and coordination with their own air forces. The absence of such integration in 1943–45 had doomed the German counteroffensives. At a strategic level, the Apache symbolized the death of Blitzkrieg as originally conceived. The Lightning War of 1940 had depended on speed, surprise, and concentration of armor. By the time the Apache prowled the skies, each of those ingredients had been compromised. Speed was blunted by bombed-out bridges and strafed convoys. Surprise was lost because Allied reconnaissance, guided by aircraft, spotted movements early. Concentration was punished mercilessly, as dive bombing made massed columns vulnerable. The Germans' failure to adapt their doctrine, to disperse more aggressively, to integrate air defenses, or to develop equivalent attack aircraft, became a case study in rigidity. In the decades after 1945, NATO officers often cited this failure as a cautionary tale. The Apache also helped redefine what counted as efficiency in weapons procurement. Despite its relatively short production run, it had outsized influence. For the cost of a handful of tanks, the Allies produced an aircraft that could neutralize dozens. This cost-effectiveness was not lost on post-war planners, who increasingly favored aircraft investments over armored expansion. It was cheaper to build and fly planes that destroyed bridges than to field divisions of tanks that required those bridges intact. This calculus guided U.S. strategy through the Cold War, when NATO relied heavily on air superiority to compensate for numerical inferiority in tanks against the Warsaw Pact. In technical terms, the Apache demonstrated the value of precision over brute force. Its dive breaks, unusual on a fighter-derived airframe, made near-vertical attacks possible. This precision mattered in Italy's mountains and Normandy's hedgerows, where collateral damage could block Allied advances as much as German resistance. Later aircraft borrowed from this principle, incorporating advanced targeting systems, guided munitions, and design philosophies that prioritized accuracy. In a sense, the Apache was an ancestor not only of the A-10 but also of modern precision strike doctrines that rely on surgical bombing rather than saturation. Yet the Apache's legacy is not purely triumphal. It also exposed the vulnerabilities of such aircraft. Losses to flak in Italy and Normandy revealed the dangers of operating at low altitude. Pilots flew with bravery, but the attrition was steep. This reality prompted post-war innovation in standoff weapons, rockets, and missiles that could achieve the same anti-armor effect without the suicidal risks of diving within range of machine guns. Thus the Apache, by bleeding, forced a technological evolution. Its story is as much about sacrifice as about success. For historians, the Apache remains a reminder that war often turns on improvisation. It was not designed as a war-winning aircraft. It was a compromise, a stopgap, born of necessity at a moment when the Allies needed a dive bomber but could not wait for new designs. And yet, in its brief service, it proved decisive at critical junctures. This adaptability, the willingness to transform a fighter into a bomber, to accept imperfection in pursuit of opportunity, reflected the larger Allied advantage. The Germans, locked into rigid production of ever heavier tanks, lost flexibility. The Apache, imperfect but useful, embodied the opposite spirit. As late as the 1980s, during NATO exercises in Germany, references to the Apache occasionally surfaced among veterans and planners alike. It had become shorthand for the principle that no tank, however advanced, could afford to ignore the sky. In this sense, the Apache transcended its era. It was not simply a tool of 1943 to 45, but a harbinger of the future battlefield, where integration of air and ground power became non-negotiable. The final consequence is perhaps the most human. The men who flew Apaches remembered them with a mix of pride and sorrow. Pride in having turned the tide at moments when defeat seemed possible, sorrow for the losses suffered to flak and the strain of near-suicidal dives. In oral histories, veterans often described the sensation of plunging at near-vertical angles toward columns of armor, feeling both terror and exhilaration. Their voices remind us that behind every strategic lesson lies the lived experience of individuals who carried out the missions. The Apache's legacy, then, is written not only in history books but in the memories of those who flew and those who were saved by its shadow. The war ended, but the scream of its dive breaks echoed far longer. It echoed in Cold War doctrine, in the design of future aircraft, in the very idea that air superiority is the prerequisite for ground dominance. And it echoed in the warning that any nation relying too heavily on armor without accounting for the sky risks repeating the mistakes of the Panzer Divisions. In that warning, the Apache's story lives on, a weapon born of improvisation, refined by necessity, and immortalized by the ruin of those who underestimated it. The story of the A-36 Apache closes not with the statistics of sorties or the tonnage of bombs dropped, but with the image of a battlefield transformed by sound, the scream of dive breaks above, the thunder of explosions below, and the stunned silence of once mighty panzers brought to a halt. In those moments, a modest aircraft reshaped the balance of modern war. It proved that the myth of invincible armor could be undone not by building bigger tanks, but by mastering the sky. The lessons are stark. First, flexibility triumphs over rigidity. The Apache was never intended as the perfect weapon. It was a stopgap, a compromise, yet its adaptability allowed it to exploit German weaknesses at the most critical times. Meanwhile, the Panzer program, locked into ever heavier machines, became a symbol of wasted potential, unable to adapt to the new reality of air supremacy. Second, precision outweighs brute force. The Apache did not need to destroy every tank. It only needed to hit the bridges, the lead vehicle, the fuel convoy, the critical links in the chain. By doing so, it paralyzed entire divisions. This principle, learned in the skies of Italy and Normandy, shaped the doctrine of every major power in the decades that followed. Third, morale is a weapon as powerful as steel. German crews abandoned tanks not always because they were destroyed, but because they believed they soon would be. Allied infantry stood firmer because they trusted in the cover above. The psychological shadow of the Apache stretched far beyond the blast radius of its bombs. For today's viewers, there is another lesson. History is not written only by the icons, the famous names engraved on monuments or etched into textbooks. Sometimes it is written by the stopgap solution, the overlooked experiment, the machine that was never meant to be remembered but that, in the right hands, changed everything. The A-36 Apache was such a machine. As we reflect on its journey, from the deserts of Tunisia to the forests of the Ardennes, from the shattered bridges of Italy to the burning roads of Germany, we are reminded that war is decided not by myths of invincibility, but by adaptation, precision, and willpower. The Apache embodied all three, and in doing so it left behind a legacy far greater than its modest numbers suggest. And now, if this story has gripped you, If you could almost hear the shriek of the dive brakes and feel the ground shake under the weight of history, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel for more cinematic deep dives into the forgotten machines, decisive battles, and untold voices that shaped the world we live in. Hit the notification bell, share this video with those who love history as much as you do, and let's keep these echoes alive together. Because history is not only about the past. It is a lens through which we understand the present, a warning for the future, and a stage where ordinary men and extraordinary machines meet. And somewhere, in the theater of war, the Apache still dives, still screams, still reminds us that no empire, no weapon, no myth, is beyond the reach of adaptation.